Welcome to our final class 4 of understanding bid'ah in a modern context in the Sharia of Islam from an Islamic perspective. It's been an amazing journey so far. Really interesting class today. As you can see, the first slide is already up about bid'ah as a political tool. A lot of hard work gone into this, so please do appreciate that. Please do send in your feedback as well, please. And any feedback is welcome. Over to you, Sheikh Adnan. Assalamu alaikum, and over to you.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to all of you to the fourth and final, the concluding session of the Critical Study of Bid'ah course. So far in the last three sessions, we've actually had a very detailed look at Bid'ah as a theological concept, as a concept which was defined and assessed and promulgated in different ways by over time and by different groups and different people. What we really want to do today is put all of those ideas, all of the discussions that we've had so far, and to put them into the context of pre-modern, I don't know if we can call it the Muslim world, but in pre-modern society. And then perhaps we can at the end reflect on and draw on the potential or the possibility of where this concept is leading us as individuals, as people living in communities, and of course as the Muslim world on a larger scale. Because often to know where we want to go, we need to look at where we came from. So when we take a look at today's session, inshallah, and we see bid'ah in the context of politics, because politics is something that affects the lives of all of us, even if we want to make this choice of staying away from anything political, right? Can we truly be apolitical in that we are completely disassociated from politics? That's not really possible when we're living in modern society, right? It wasn't possible in the past, and it's definitely not possible now. So if we put bid'ah into a political framework, maybe we can see how this was used as a ploy, or how it was instrumentalized or politicized in the recent past, right? Less 100, 150 years ago. And then perhaps we can see if that's happening now, or if it could potentially happen, or if we see around us something similar, right, in the Muslim world. Now, the examples and the case studies that we can go through when talking about bid'ah as an instrument of politics, there's so many, because bid'ah is just an Arabic word, but really this is heresy, right, as we defined it. And heresy as a concept was used even before Muslims, and even outside the Muslim world. Europe is notorious for this. The entire schism that happened between Britain and Catholicism was based on this concept of heresy. So there are many examples of where this concept, religious heresy, was definitely and very effectively used as a political tool to attain or meet or gain certain political ends. Now, in the modern world, right, in our contemporary day and age, it seems a bit strange as to how a religious concept such as heresy could offer so much political potential to its proponents, because in modern society, religion is a private affair. It's within the four walls of your house. It's within your heart. It's not really, or it's not meant to be. In theory, it's not meant to be, right? Something that is impacted or influenced by the state, by the government, by politics. Religion is something completely personal. And I say in theory because in reality, we know it's not like that, right? Islamophobia is a real thing, and it's fueled by politics. But for the most part, do we really expect to see heresy and religious ideas having the same political influence that they once possessed in medieval Europe, or in the 18th century Arabia, or 19th century South Asia? It's possible, but again, it's something we will think about and reflect on at the end. So we're living in a time where we have nation states we have nation states, and within this nation Westphalian system, religious identity is a personal identity. States don't tend to have or proclaim a particular religion. Of course, countries across the world may have a population that follows the majority of the population may follow a certain religious belief. Like in England, the majority follow Christianity, but I'm sure the statistics changed and atheism was outgrowing Christianity. But the state is not a Christian state, right? So in this context, would we really see it's difficult to understand how a religious concept then could be utilized by a state actor, such as a government or a leader or anyone like that, and then how they would take that to meet certain political ends. But the world that we are talking about in today's session is a world which predates the Westphalian system, this idea of having a nation state where all citizens are equal and their primary identity is based on the nation state. So it's not really that important if you're Muslim or Christian or something else, but you are English, you are British, you are Chinese, you are Japanese. There's this national identity which overrides individual religious beliefs. In that world, that's the world of empires. Okay. Although the Westphalian system really was proposed in the 1600s and the 17th century, it reached its peak in the 1800s. So up until the 1800s, most of the world, up until then, had followed a similar system of organization. The world consisted of empires, and these empires were rooted in a religious identity, right? So we're going to talk about that in a short while, inshallah, just to contextualize what we're talking about and what we'll be looking at. After that, we'll move swiftly into the core aim of today's session, which is having a look at two cases of where bid'ah and the idea of heresy was used by Muslim groups for political reasons, and how this idea of heresy was then utilized by them, instrumentalized by these Muslims to do what they did. Really, I don't want to give too much away until we get to it, but how they used this to gain power, dominance, how they established a un-Islamic patriarchy in some cases, an un-Islamic version of it, and how they would use these concepts then to suppress the mass population. So we have two examples from opposite ends of the spectrum. One is from very early, the Khawarij. This is from the time of the Sahaba. That's what I mean by early Islam here, from the time of the Sahaba. And then we have a pre-modern example, which we will go through, a pre-modern case. And this is really from the beginning of the 1700s. That's what we're talking about, the pre-modern. I've called it pre-modern because it runs right through up until 1930. And then inshallah at the end, we'll spare a few minutes to take some questions from you guys. So the kind of world order we're talking about, whether it's the Khawarij, early Islam, whether it's the Saudi Wahhabi alliance of the 1700s, which ran right through until the 1930s, we're talking about really a pre-Westphalian world. So this is a world where the whole world is divided into empires, and the empires justify their authority through religion. So in the Ming dynasty, for example, they consider the Ming dynasty, the central kingdom, to be a replica of the equilibrium, the balance, and the mandate of heaven. They consider themselves to be the center of the central kingdom, right? The Ming dynasty, solely because they considered their dynasty, their empire, to be a reflection of the empire or the world in the heavens, while everyone else was far away from that. So authority belonged to them, not only in their local region, but they were justified to then expand their borders and conquer the whole world, which they didn't, of course. But this is the idea behind it. The Ottoman Empire was no different. It was clearly based on an Islamic identity. To be Muslim, to be Ottoman, well, it was the same. Well, it was the same thing. This idea of having Ottomanization and non-Muslim citizens. Well, this only started in the 1800s. due to British and French influence. Before that, the Ottomans followed the millet system, and the community was divided based on their the millet system. You had Muslims, you had Jews. Jews lived in Jewish quarters, Christians lived in Christian quarters, Muslims lived in Muslim quarters. This wasn't strange for that time, right? The Roman Empire had a religious basis for their rule, for their governance, and for the entire concept of being a Roman. It was rooted in a religious identity. Religion was powerful in those days. When the Romans conquered certain areas, they would go there and they would sometimes replace the local gods with their own Roman gods. And if that was too controversial, they would amalgamate both gods. They did this in Greece a lot. They would amalgamate Greek and Roman gods to form a new god who would appease both types of citizens. Because just because the Greeks were, for example, conquered by the Romans, they didn't consider themselves to be Roman citizens. They were still whatever religion they belonged to. However, near the mid-1800s, about 200 years after the Treaty of Westphalia, the world began to move towards nation states. Okay, so the division of people was not based on their religious identity anymore. It was based on your nation state. So no matter what religion you belong to is one nation. So you have a shared identity, and here you have the same rights. So in the Ottoman Empire, around the 1860s is when the Tanzimat reforms began. And up until this point, the Christians were allowed to have their own, like the Armenian Christians, they were allowed to have their own religious ruler who governed them. The Tanzimat reforms sound like it was a good thing, right? Everyone was equal before the state, but actually a lot of religious minorities had problems with it because their autonomy was taken away. Suddenly they had to be under the centralized Ottoman government. But up until then, because they were not Muslim, they were given certain reliefs, like the Armenian Christians were allowed to have their own, they had their own version of the Pope, who could collect taxes and be the ruler over the Armenian Christians. They didn't have to complete compulsory military service. That was only for Muslims. Non-Muslims didn't have to do that. And all of this, right? But in the 1860s, then it changed and they began the process of Ottomanization. So now you have a national identity. Doesn't matter if you're Muslim or Christian, you are Ottoman. So in that context, right? In that context, religion is very powerful. To go against the state religion is to commit treason against the state. This is the kind of world we are describing. So let's begin with the Khawarij in early Islam. The Khawarij have a strange, unique, idiosyncratic, right, if you will, history. The Khawarij really were born out of the first fitna. So there are 3, sometimes 4 time periods or 4 major events that took place in early Islam, which are called the 4 tribulations, and each one marks the birth of a different sect. So the first tribulation was the civil war between the Sahaba, between the forces of Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu and the forces of those who opposed him, Amir Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. This civil war is not something we'll go into, but when this civil war occurred, if you attend the 4 caliphs course with Ustad Uthman, he will definitely he will go into a lot of detail about this civil war, its background, what actually happened, and then the aftermath. But for our purpose, it's enough to know that there was a civil war between the Sahaba, and at one point, Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu, who was a caliph at the time, he decided to accept arbitration, which was to meet some middle ground, and his representatives met with the representatives of Muawiyah, and they agreed to settle the dispute. There were a group of people who believed that being the caliph, Sayyidina Ali should not have agreed to this process of dialogue, because apparently, and this was their misinterpretation, they took a verse of the Quran and they misinterpreted it, and the interpretation yielded this idea that dialogue with a group of people who rebel against the caliph is absolutely invalid and you should go to war with them. And because you are not doing that, they would address an Ali like this. Because you are not agreeing to the verse of the Quran, you are carrying a dialogue with these people, whereas you should be fighting them. So because you have disobeyed the command of Allah, you are no longer a Muslim. So they anathematized Sayyidina Ali, accused him of heresy, and they declared him, excommunicated him, and declared him a disbeliever. They also included in this anathematization Amir Muawiyah and the Caliph before Ali, Sayyidina Uthman. They considered all of them to be disbelievers, and they dissented. Okay, and they moved and they settled in a place called Harura, and there were about 12,000 of them. Now, these guys have got a reckless history because subsequent Muslim caliphates, whether it's the Umayyads or the Abbasids, were constantly threatened by this group of dissenters. Of course, the original dissenters had died by now, but the ideology lived on. This idea of rebellion, of we have to topple the government and have a revolution, and sounds like communism, but and we have to topple the state and establish the law of God, right? Even though the caliphs were actually Muslim and they were establishing the word of Allah. It's not like they were completely away from Islam. So this group of dissenters, they started off as a religious political movement. They had this strong political ideology. So how did they justify what they did? Well, what did they do, first of all? They broke into many subgroups. The most extreme of these was the Azariqa. The Azariqa accused all people who disagreed with them of heresy, of polytheism, and of bid'ah, of shirk. They accused anyone who opposed them. So they wouldn't just say that a group of Muslims, and this is very important, it wasn't enough for them to accuse people of heresy because of certain practices they did. That wasn't the problem. They accused the vast majority of Muslims of heresy because the vast majority of Muslims disagreed with the ideas of the movement. That's what they considered heresy. So it wasn't something that other people were doing. It was what they weren't doing that was a problem. And what weren't they doing was supporting the ideology of the Khawarij movement. They did eventually carve out a little mini state for themselves. So once they declared the vast majority of the Muslim community as heretics, this gave them a legal justification to go to war with them, with subsequent governments, and they committed atrocities across Arabia. They killed thousands of people. They would take Muslim women, Muslim men, Muslim children. They allowed the killing of anyone who opposed their right. So all heretics, they believed you can kill them, whether it's a man, a woman, or a child. So there, again, due to time constraints, we can't go into too much detail about what they exactly did. But I do have one example here. We should, inshallah, I think, really bring to light what this group was about and how they utilized the idea of polytheism and heresy to commit mass murder. So this is a testimony, first-hand testimony taken from the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shaybah. So I won't read all of it, but the gist of it is that there was a person, a sub-narrator here, who was involved with the Khariji movement, with the Khawarij, and he gave this testimony. He said, well, I was affiliated with them, meaning I was part of their ideological movement. I was with them, right? And he left them eventually, and then he provides a reason, right? And he explains why he left. And he says that, well, I left them after this incident happened. There was a companion called Khabbab, a companion of the Prophet ﷺ, right? He says that his son, Khabbab's son called Abdullah, he was once walking past, and I was with a group of the Khawarij, and we were here, and he was coming out, and there's a river, a stream, right? A nahar, a small stream between us, or a small river, and he saw them, and he was terrified. I haven't even gone into a description of what they look like. They would outgrow their beards and their hair would be a mess. And this is how they were. And we have first-hand accounts of them being described like this. And he was a bit terrified. So that group noticed this individual, right? They didn't know who he is, but they noticed there's a person there and he's a bit scared, looks a bit scared. So they rushed over to him, crossed into the stream, and they stood in the stream. And they asked him, who are you? He said, I'm Abdullah ibn Khabbab. So they recognized that this is a tabi'i. He's a son of a companion. So they asked him to teach them a hadith, tell them something that he learned from his father, because his father would have taken that from the Prophet ﷺ. And this is the hadith, right? So you might think it's provocative, but he was making a statement. He decided to quote the following hadith. He said to them, sure, my father told me that he heard the Prophet ﷺ saying that tribulation is coming, fitna ja'iyah, right? Tribulation is coming, a tribulation is coming, a calamity is coming. The one who sits during the calamity is better than the one who stands, meaning don't take part in it, don't join any side, right? Remain neutral. The one who sits during it is better than the one who stands, and the one who stands is better than the one who walks. When you meet them, those people who bring on this tribulation, and if you are able to do so, then be the servant of Allah who is killed by them, and don't be the servant of Allah, don't be the person who commits the killing, right? So don't join them, don't engage with them, remain neutral. When they heard this, they knew he's talking about them, that they are the tribulation, they are the mass murderers. What's wrong with that? You think, right? What's the worst he's doing here? He's insulting them. But for them, this was heresy. He's opposing the ideology. This is heresy. And so they drew close to him and they decapitated him. And then they took his wife and they, as is in front of you, they dismembered her stomach also. And she was pregnant at the time. This is the kind of level of barbaric behavior that the Khawarij were led to by their idea of people opposing them and how that tantamounts to heresy. They would always quote the Quran. This is something they were renowned for. They would quote the Quran. And Sayyidina Ali would say to them that, this is kalimatul haqq turadu biha al-batil, that these words are true, it's the word of the Quran, but what you intend by it is false. So are there any questions before we carry on? Okay. So that's an early example. Now we move on to a more recent example. So again, to contextualize this, to contextualize this, we are now talking about a time around the 1700s, mid-1700s. So it's the 18th century. At this time, in the 18th century, the context is that the Ottoman Empire is in full power. But when it comes to the Arabian Peninsula, so this idea of Saudi Arabia doesn't exist yet. Saudi Arabia came into being in 1930. And the Prophet ﷺ, of course, never called it Saudi Arabia. It was called Jaziratul Arab, the Arabian Peninsula. Now, this Arabian Peninsula consists of many small states. The Hijaz, which is Mecca, Medina, the sanctuary, the Hijaz is under the direct control of the Ottoman Empire. As for the other areas, so in the south of Arabia, you've got an area called Najd, and there are small towns, Uyayna, for example. These are not directly under the control of the Ottoman Empire, they are under the suzerainty of the Ottoman Empire, which means that there were each of these locations, villages and towns, they had their own local rulers, and the Ottoman Empire gave them relative autonomy. So, and what that meant was, practically meant was then that the internal affairs could be handled and controlled by those individual rulers of the villages and towns. They could collect taxes, they could govern people, they could deal with all internal matters. The only thing that the Ottoman Empire would deal with is the foreign policy. Okay, the foreign policy of those areas would be controlled by the Ottoman Empire. So they had relative independence. Now, what I'm going to go through, because the people who are going to speak about and the founders of these movements and the political leaders, because they have living followers, these can be controversial ideas. And what I always make very clear is that the only basis of our discussion will be anything that's documented. Anything that's not documented or based on speculation, right, just pure speculation without any evidential basis whatsoever. These are the kind of things that I avoid. Okay, so just to give you an example of that, there's an idea that the founders of the Saudi Wahhabi alliance, so Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, for example, on the religious side, and the House of Saud on the political side, when these two came into an alliance, they were fueled, or they were driven to do this, and they were driven to do whatever we're going to talk about now by the British. And that is not backed by any evidence whatsoever. There is no evidence of any correspondence between the British in the 1700s and anyone in the Arabian Peninsula at that time. Absolutely not. And politically, it doesn't make sense either, because in the 1700s, the British were politically allied to the Ottomans. So there is no way that they would undermine their powerful ally for a group of people from some villages in the south of Arabia. It's a bad political move, and they wouldn't have done that. They weren't in a position to do that. In the 1700s, they had just about gotten a license to sell tea and to trade in in India, right? So that's not documented. The first communication between the British and the Saudi powers is documented in the 1800s. And there's a letter sent by a imam from the Wahhabi movement to the British to give them support. And he promised to then fight against anyone who is against the British, i.e. the Ottomans and anyone. And he never received a reply from the British. Never received a reply. So, yeah. When the Saudi state was set up in 1930, then absolutely there were, and I spoke about this in the history of sectarianism course in a lot of detail, there were civil servants, and there was a MI5 agent. It's not a secret, this is like in the open, who became one of the advisors in 1930, in the 30s, when the Saudi state was set up. And that's all. There's a book that's attributed to a British spy. I can't remember what it's called, but in there's a whole narrative of how Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab visited Baghdad, he visited Basra, and he met a sheikh there. And the sheikh was really an MI5 agent who was dressed like a Muslim. And then he put these ideas into Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab's mind that you should go back and you should, there's idolatry and shirk going on in your country and you should get rid of it under the Ottomans. And that book is a forgery, right? It was written by an Ottoman general. Because it was war, right? There's war going on between the Ottomans and the Saudi Wahhabi alliance, and so war is treachery, and so that book was written to feed the propaganda against the Wahhabi movement. It's not a real, reliable work. So I'll be basing most of our discussion on are reliable sources. So these are citations from travelogues by travelers who were in these places at the time. Some of them are Muslim, some of them aren't Muslim. We're basing it on Uyun al-Majd, which is a reliable history written by someone who's affiliated with the Wahhabi movement. And he's from the 1800s. So he was born, he wrote his history of Najd about 90 years after these, or 100 years after these incidents had happened. And he was also the Mufti of Mecca under the Wahhabi movement. And so he's a reliable scholar, Ibn Bishr. And a few other sources. So to understand how heresy plays into all of this, let's have a look at a brief timeline. to contextualize things, and then we move on to the main discussion, inshallah. So in 1703, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is born in the village of Uyayna. That's very important. Uyayna is very important. And his father is a Sunni Sufi Hanbali scholar. Nothing much happens for the next 30 or so years. In 1740, he begins preaching in a place called Huraymila. Okay, we'll have a look at that name. That sounds like a typo. And then Uyayna, and he was expelled from both towns. And he was expelled from both towns because of these ideas that he was preaching. So what are those ideas? We'll look at shortly, inshallah. He then moved to Dir'iyya, a small market town ruled by Muhammad ibn Saud. And here is where the alliance was forged between the two groups. Muhammad ibn Saud was a local village ruler, and he came into this alliance with Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab because of, well, the key reason was Muhammad ibn Saud wanted to expand his territories. He wanted to be more than just a local, village tribal ruler. But how does religion play into this? Because by giving him a religious justification, and we'll see what the justification is in a minute, and is rooted in the idea of heresy, that everyone else is a heretic. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab would enforce this religious ideology, his religious ideology on the population. He will collect taxes. So taxes will go to, of course, Muhammad ibn Saud as the head of state. And when he has the money, he can recruit people, and we'll see how he did that shortly. And after that recruiting happens, he can begin to expand the borders and eventually lead to a unified Arabia. So it was a marriage of convenience, and it worked. In 1744, the first Saudi Wahhabi state is established around Riyadh or Najd. So that's not a major achievement because Riyadh was not under the Ottomans, directly under the Ottomans anyway. In 1792, they annexed Qasim and Kharj. So right now what we're seeing here, by the way, is rebellion against the caliphate. And that's illegal in Islam. So how could they justify it? And how could people who were joining their movement, the Bedouin fighters, the Ikhwan, they're called the Ikhwan, but nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood today. Right? How could these fighters, these ruthless fighters that were joining, how could they join them when they know that our movement is fighting against the caliphate? This is haram, this is illegal, they're rebelling against the caliph. Well, it was justified primarily by saying that your caliph is not really a caliph anyway. The Ottomans are Muslim, the heretics, they're committing polytheism. In 1797, Hassa and Qatif and Qatar and Bahrain were taken in 1797. That's quite significant. In 1804, they sacked Mecca and Medina, invaded the Hijaz, and they took it. Okay. The Muslim men were massacred, the women were taken as slaves. In 1802, they sacked Karbala. There's a difference of opinion if it's 1801 or 1802. I think the most reliable opinion, it was in April of 1802. There are three Wahhabi states altogether. So the first one was established. No demolition took place at this time. We're going to talk about the demolition later. So there wasn't much demolition here, but they massacred the men, which is of course far worse. Then in 1818, the Ottomans responded. They dispatched their forces under Ibrahim Pasha, rahmatullah alayh, and the Saudi Wahhabi alliance, they surrendered. They were outnumbered and they were outmaneuvered, so they surrendered. But not for long, because a few years later, in 1824, they came back. This is the second wave in the Hijaz, and this time they defeated the Ottomans, and they established the second Saudi state. This was the second wave. This is when most of the demolitions took place. They destroyed certain mosques. All of the shrines in Baqiya were demolished. But then again, the Ottomans retaliated. They took the Hijaz again. But then in 1902, the third Wahhabi wave came, and this was a permanent takeover. Now, in 1902, the Ottomans were expelled, and they were already, they lost Egypt, they lost Palestine. They were fighting against the colonial forces on other borders. and they were very weak at this stage. So they left Hijaz under the third Wahhabi state, and then in 1932, this Wahhabi state was then, of course, made into a unified Arabia called Saudi Arabia. These are some of the key political events. Now we need to look at how heresy fed into this, the idea of heresy. Okay, it's 1932, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was formed. And when this formation took place, the old alliance from the 1700s was maintained. The House of Saud would control politics, foreign policy, internal policy, and the descendants of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the al-Sheikh, would control religious policy and be given the highest positions of religious authority. The head mufti of the state, the head muftis of the councils, right? The awqaf. So how did heresy feed into this? Let's have a look at this. Now, this is a direct quote from okay. So this is a direct quote from that early history that history book that I described to you. So when Shaykh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab reached Huraymila, he sat with his father and began to rebuke the heretical and polytheistic practices of the ignorant population, right? The bid'ah and the shirk that the population of what we would call Muslims in Arabia were doing. Eventually, this led to a disagreement between him and his father, and between him and the townspeople, and this is why he was expelled from Uyayna and from this Huraymila, because of these ideas that he was promoting. The ideas in themselves may not have been controversial, but the ideas that, I mean, Tawheed is not controversial, right? To be a Muslim, we need Tawheed. But what was controversial was the implications of his approach to Tawheed. His approach to Tawheed meant believing that the vast majority of people around him are not Muslim. And if they're not Muslim, now that justified fighting against them, taking their properties in the name of spoils of war. He continued like this for many years until his father passed away in 1740, and that's when he publicly made his call to, he's called his dawah, right? A'lana da'wata, in this year. Began to call people towards his movement. So this is just where Huraymila is. It's not too far from Najd, from Riyadh in Najd. Just a quick summary here. So based on his idea of heresy, and in his letters also, he described the population and the rulers. Who are the rulers? There are two types of rulers. There's the imperial rulers, the Ottoman Sultan and the governors, and then the local village rulers in those independent towns and villages across parts of Arabia, outside the Hijaz region. Right? Described them all as heretics. He considered all of them heretics. And because they were heretics, they were not allowed to be in charge of the Hijaz, of Mecca, and be guardians of the sanctuaries of Mecca and Medina. So they need to be deposed. This gave him a legal justification and gave the entire movement a legal justification to now fight jihad against these people, because they're not Muslim. So they need to be removed from the Arabian Peninsula, and we need to instate and establish Muslim rule. At the moment, there is no Muslim rule. Even though these people are praying Salah, they have Jumu'ah, they have the Khutbah, right? They're not Muslim because of the heresies that they are committing. Now, in this very history book, because it's written by a person belonging to this movement, whenever he refers to the other people of Arabia, the Ottomans and the normal citizens of Arabia, he refers to them as Juhal, ignorant people, and Ahlul Batil. And this is significant. Ahlul Batil, people of falsehood. And whenever he refers to the followers of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and the people who are leading all these campaigns, and that book, by the way, is in 2 volumes. It gives you a detailed, we have other sources too, but he gives a detailed analysis year by year of the massacres and the wars that were committed by this movement. But for the author, that historian, it's a matter of pride. It's something to boast about because his movement was purging Arabia, right, getting rid of polytheism and heresy from Arabia. So whenever he refers to those followers of that movement, he refers to them as Muslims, the Muslimun. The Muslims fought the people of Uyayna. The Muslims fought the people of Batil. The Muslims fought the people of Hijaz. Okay. The name of the book and the other question I will inshallah answer at the end. It's in Arabic. So that's very significant, referring to the rest of the population as just people and referring to the followers of this small movement, right? This tiny movement as Muslims, meaning that these are the Muslims, the others are not Muslim. Young men from Bedouin communities primarily were recruited for this endeavor to purge Arabia of all heresies and to restore true monotheism. This is the drive. Everyone else is committing heresy. We are on Tawheed, and we need to now get rid of this heresy from our pure land of Arabia, the Hijaz, Mecca, and Medina. What you have here, by the way, is a direct. Okay, so let's have a read of this. The Sheikh ordered them to make jihad. So anything in quotation marks is a direct citation. The Sheikh ordered them to make jihad, right? The word jihad for 1400 years and in all of throughout Islamic history, throughout Islamic literature, the term jihad is always used when it's a case of Muslims either defending themselves or believers fighting against oppressive non-believers. It was never when the Sahaba fought the civil war, for example, Sayyidina Ali never referred to it as a jihad against the people of Muawiyah because he knew that they are believers. But the Shaykh ordered them to make jihad, and they obeyed. They invaded some of the Bedouin areas first, and what did they do? And I put this in red. They took spoils of war. So it's not looting anymore. You know, if you steal from people, that's looting, it's theft. No, this is not looting. This was Muslims fighting against non-Muslim, illegal occupants of our land, even though they were Arabs, they were born there, everything, but they're not Muslim, they were heretics. So the forces of this movement, of our movement, in his perspective, invaded and they took the properties as spoils of war. When you read the Seerah and you see the Sahaba fought against the Quraysh who were very hostile towards the Muslims and they took the spoils of war. It's that same idea, except here it's being used to justify and to explain the atrocities that were committed by one group of people against a group of believers. So you have to read between the lines. It's all in the wording that's used. The point of these examples is starting with this very beginning statement, is to show how the entire movement, the entire political endeavor, which led to many atrocities that we'll see, started with and was rooted in the idea that these people are committing heresies. And this is what gave the founders of these movements the power to recruit people, because ideology is very powerful. Of course, they had material reasons to join. They were looting every place that they went to. And so, yeah, there was a financial gain for them. But because these people were Muslim at the end of the day, the Bedouins, they needed some sort of religious justification. And this was the religious justification. People are committing heresy. And we need to restore monotheism. If you remember, in 1730, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was expelled from Uyayna. Well, 10 years later, he returned. First, he sent his forces and then he came later. So in 1740, he was expelled. 1750, he comes back 10 years later under this pretext. The ruler of Uyayna, I'm imagining this is the person who expelled him, whose name was Uthman ibn Muammar. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab ordered for him to be killed. Now, how do you justify killing a Muslim ruler of an area or a fellow Muslim? How do you justify that? Well, in his letter that he wrote, he said, Uthman ibn Muammar is a heretical polytheist. He's a heretic, right? He's a mushrik. He's a mushrik kafir. These are the words that he used. He's a mushrik. He's a polytheist and he's committing heresy. So you can kill him. He shouldn't be ruling over Muslims. And so in Rajab, on a Friday, in 1750, his forces went in, and after everyone had prayed the Jummah prayer, this man had just prayed Jummah, but they still considered him a polytheist. He had prayed Jummah, and in the masjid, they killed him. And then Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab went out to Uyayna later and appointed a person from his own movement as the governor over this area. And then the tax collection began, right? And he was also described, the person they killed, Uthman ibn Muammar, he was also described as, one of the reasons to kill him was he was affiliated with the people of falsehood and close to the enemies of the Muslims. Who are these people of falsehood that he was affiliated with? He was affiliated with the Ottoman Empire. He was affiliated with the Ottoman rulers of the Hijaz and of people who had rejected the Wahhabi movement's ideas. So they are referred to as the people of falsehood, Ahlul Batil, and they're described as being the enemies of the Muslims, right? So, meaning the Wahhabi movement. So we are the Muslims, they are not. Before we continue with this, I would like to just summarize some key ideas here that we can pick up from reading. Again, I can't summarize everything into 1 hour, but it's profound when you read the amount of killing that took place in the name of Tawheed and in the name of removing heresy. This is akin to what we saw in the Christian world several times throughout the Middle Ages, which is religious Puritanism. Right? Now, this was the birth of Islamic Puritanism. Puritanism is a narrow approach to any religious tradition. For in this context, what it means then is that the idea of establishing Tawheed and removing Bid'ah from the community is so important that there is no other Islam. Islam is, yeah, you have Salah, you have Zakah, but these are like side issues. Islam primarily is opposing heresy. That is Islam. The reason for your creation and your purpose on earth is to be a warrior of the truth, right? Have this burden of the world on your shoulders and to purify society, purge society of heresy. This idea of Puritanism is defined by certain traits, and we find these within this movement. We see these exemplified within this movement. First on, there's a siege mentality. So a siege mentality is this idea that it's a type of paranoia that everyone who isn't from our movement is against us, is hostile towards us. Therefore, we are under threat. This is a good political tool because what it allows groups of people from different tribes in that context, different tribes and different areas to do is come together under one common cause, which is survival. We are on Tawheed. We have to unite in order to survive and ensure that our ideology of Tawheed, our version of Tawheed survives in the face of the threat that we're following from the heretics who are in the majority. This is followed by a bombastic dogma. A bombastic dogma is simply this oversimplified approach to anything. We're talking about religion here. So it's an oversimplification of religion. It involves using powerful rhetoric to communicate that oversimplified idea. But upon analysis, the idea lacks substance. It sounds good. Essentially, that's what I'm saying. It sounds good, but it's not free of problems. So this would be an idea like we only need to follow Quran and Hadith, right? As though it's that simple. Anyone who has studied the Deen to a good level would know that this is just an oversimplification of so many complex issues, right? There's no critical engagement with heritage. That's a key feature of Puritanism, whether it happens in South Asia, in Britain, or at this time in Arabia. Right? The idea that heresy is so powerful and is taking over Muslim minds, and we have to be the saviors and get rid of this heresy. That idea is so powerful that it blinds the Puritans from, or puritanical people from, then engaging with the wider heritage which has contributed to what made that society what it is. So you have practices, for example, amongst Muslims in South Asia, in Arabia at that time, and these practices don't necessarily conflict with Islam, but they are practices that are birthed and fostered by the local culture. And Islam didn't come to destroy culture. As long as it doesn't conflict with Islam, culture is a beautiful thing and it gives us individuality. We're not all just meant to be one homogenous, group of people. We all speak Arabic. We all have to wear Arab clothing. We all have to. That's not what Islam is. There are sensationalist acts of dominance. So these sensationalist acts of dominance have to take place regularly in order to communicate to the followers. So in this case, it was the Bedouins, to communicate to them that we are serious and we are dedicated to our cause. How are we dedicated to the cause? Well, we are carrying out all of these acts. These are sensationalist acts. They are like, what would be the equivalent of this? Please tell me at the end. It happens in celebrities do it all the time, I think. But this is a lot more sinister. So this includes going into a city and not gradually phasing out an issue, but just so they disagreed that shrine should be built over the graves of the Sahaba. Fine, as an academic position, we can talk about that, right? You can assess that. So there would be a way to deal with that problem that remains, I suppose, which accommodates people's cultural sensitivities. People are living in Medina. They're used to building these domes over the shrines of the Sahaba, of the grave of Sayyidina Fatima, going there once a week, making dua. But a puritanical movement can't tolerate that, and it can't phase out these practices gradually. So they would come in, second phase, and just demolish all of the shrines and leave the rubble there. There are other sensationalist acts of dominance which I don't want to talk about now. We will see it later, inshallah. It's sensationalist because there's no thought behind it. It's just, let's go in and destroy everything in the name of revival, in the name of purification. There's a suspension of moral principles and okay, so many of these, any puritanical group, so those who are rooted in removing heresy, they will often suspend moral principles, and they justify that by invoking higher ends. So, for example, how would this movement justify killing 5,000 people in Karbala at the shrine of Imam Hussein? Right? How would they justify that? They would justify it by saying that there's a higher purpose we want to achieve. Karbala is a center of shirk. People go there, they go to the shrine of Imam Hussein. This is a heresy, and we are God's warriors on earth, and we have to, as Muslims, we have to get rid of this. And those people that we're killing, they're not, this is what the idea would be. They're not Muslim anyway. They're committing polytheism, they're committing heresy. And so they will go in and they will kill those people. So they're invoking a higher end, right? This idea of restoring Islam at the cost of carrying out deprived acts of murder. So in 1802 or 1801, it's April 1802, most likely. 1802, about 12,000 followers of this movement went into Karbala, again, under the pretext that people here are committing heresy, bid'ah, and we have to purify the land, right? The whole world has to be purged of heresy. So they went in to Karbala, which they consider a major center of shirk and of polytheism, of heresy. They scaled the walls, went in, and they killed the majority of the people who were in the markets and the homes of Karbala. Okay. There was a king, a ruler, an emperor called Nadir Shah. When he invaded India, he took a lot of treasures, right, from India, golds, gems, and he donated them to the shrine of Imam Hussein, right? Which I think marvelous. That's another religious justification. So anyway, when the Wahhabi movement got there, they killed thousands of people and they looted the shrine of Imam Hussein. Right? They even took the carpets, the clothing, everything. Now, interestingly, when this happened, there was a non-Muslim French traveler who was in Iraq at the time, and he has a travel log. It's in French, but sections have been translated. He was there in Iraq at the time, and in 1809, his journal was published. So he gives us a contemporary account of what actually happened. And this word Wahhabi, by the way, isn't a new word. When the movement started, people who are outside the movement will refer to them as the Wahhabi movement. They are referred to as Wahhabi movement in British literature from the 1800s. They're referred to as Wahhabi by these travelers who were there. That label is used. And what it shows is that historically, even outside religious Islamic Muslim circles, they had an independent identity, which really stood out because of the brutality that they worked with. So this is the French traveler. Okay. So he says, I just took a screenshot of his book and put it here. He says, we have recently seen a horrible example of the Wahhabis' cruel fanaticism, okay, in the terrible fate of the shrine of Imam Hussein, radiallahu anhu. I will leave that with you. There's two parts to what I wanted to cite from him. So he continues, and this is the part I want to focus on, because he gives us figures here. And he says, that day came at last, 12,000 Wahhabis suddenly attacked the mosque of Imam Hussein after seizing more spoils than they had ever seized after their greatest victories. They put everything to fire and the sword, old people, women, and children. Everybody died at the barbarians' sword. Besides, it is said that whenever they saw a pregnant woman, they disemboweled her and left the fetus on the mother's bleeding corpse. Their cruelty could not be satisfied. They did not cease their murders and blood flowed like water. As a result of the bloody catastrophe, more than 4,000 people perished. The figures are between 3,000 and 5,000. The Wahhabis carried off their plunder on the back of more than 4,000 camels. Okay, and then they attempted to demolish the shrine itself, which for them was akin to just an idol. Okay. So it's already 9:05. There are several other cases of where heresy has been politicized and used for political ends, which we could have looked at. I've left some ideas here. Of course, you're more than welcome to take this. The notes will be sent out to you and you can have a look at this. Look it up in your own time, inshallah. So these are just some historical examples. In the notes, you'll find some slides about the demolition of Baqi Cemetery in Medina and about the destruction of the 2 sanctuaries, again, in the name of purification. That these were all major heresies that were going on, right? Building domes over graves, and these were heresies. And there are external accounts. There's a non-Muslim traveler who was in Medina. He disguised himself. He was a Swiss traveler, and he disguised himself as an Afghan pilgrim. And then this is what he saw when he got to Medina, post-demolition. So this is after the second wave of Wahhabism in Hijaz. So, as you can see, it was a very powerful tool. It led to a huge movement, which not only challenged the caliphate, but led to its eventual fall. And since that time till today, we don't have a caliph. Beyond that, it allowed a group of people the idea of heresy, it allowed them to justify the killing of thousands and thousands of men, women, and children. This model was then replicated about 90 years, 100 years later in South Asia. It was repeated, but that's a whole different discussion. But it wasn't repeated with such brutality, but it was definitely repeated. And there are papers written on direct parallels between these early movements and how they've influenced many extreme and terrorist organizations today. But again, this is a discussion we can have, inshallah, next time. What I will do now is, we've got a few minutes to take some questions, inshallah. So I've got some here in the chat. I think I'll start with those. So in the modern era, so the Wahhabi movement today, why do they say they follow the, do they say follow the few and not the majority? They say that the Prophet ﷺ, why do they confuse people like that and blind them from following the majority? You should always follow the majority. And the reason for that is because that's exactly what the Prophet ﷺ said, right? Inna ummati la tajtami ala dalala, my ummah will never unite on misguidance. فَإِذَا رَأَيْتُمُ اخْتِلَافًا فَعَلَيْكُمُ السَّوَادُ الْأَعْظَمُ. And when you see them differing, then follow the way of the majority. But truth is not based on these things, all right? Truth is not based on should I follow the majority or the minority. Truth is based on its own merit, its own evidence, its own what it's based on.